Have you ever been silenced when your heart was screaming for justice? What would you do if truth itself was on trial? Stay. Trust me, this story will pierce your soul. The gavel slammed against the polished oak, its sharp echo silencing the crowded courtroom. For a moment, even the dust motes floating in the shafts of light seemed frozen, suspended in the tension that coiled through the air. Every camera was pointed at the young woman standing alone before the judge, her hands trembling as they clutched the folds of her modest dress, the fabric stretched over the swell of her pregnant belly. Her name was Elena Marshall, and today was supposed to be the day she lost everything. The lawyer representing her ex-husband moved with a predator's grace, his smirk wide as he slammed down another stack of papers. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "this woman has nothing. No property, no income, no claim to the fortune my client built with his own two hands. She is wasting this court's valuable time. We demand the immediate dismissal of her claims." Gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across notebooks as photographers clicked their shutters. Elena's face burned under the weight of their gaze. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to tell the truth that burned inside her chest. But every time she opened her mouth, her husband's lawyer cut her down with another objection. She was silenced, again and again. Across the courtroom, her ex-husband, Richard Hale, sat with his new fiancée, a glamorous socialite draped in diamonds. Richard leaned back in his chair, his confidence radiating like a shield. To him, this was nothing more than a performance. He was untouchable, a billionaire whose empire stretched from New York to Singapore. He had money, power, and an army of attorneys. Elena? She had no one. Or so everyone thought. The judge's weary voice cut through the rising whispers. "Mrs. Marshall, if you cannot provide evidence to support your petition, this court will be forced to rule in favor of Mr. Hale." Elena's knees buckled slightly. She had begged for this chance, believing the system would hear her out, that justice might be possible. But now, with the weight of the court pressing against her, she realized how naive she had been. She pressed her palm to her stomach, feeling the faint kick of the child growing inside her. That small, fragile heartbeat was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. The opposing lawyer pounced on the moment. "Your Honor, let's not pretend. This woman is only here to shame my client with baseless claims. She was nothing but a mistake in his past. And the child?" The words hung in the air like a knife. The child. Elena's throat tightened. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She wanted to scream that her baby was not a mistake, that this child deserved recognition, love, and protection. But the words tangled in her throat. Years of being silenced, ignored, and discarded by Richard had conditioned her into silence. And now, in the most important battle of her life, she was voiceless once more. The judge sighed, lifting the pen that would end it all. The papers sat before her, the ink still drying on Richard's motions to terminate all financial support. If she signed, Elena would walk out of this courtroom with nothing. No home, no future, no security for her unborn child. The crowd shifted forward in anticipation. Journalists smelled blood. Richard smirked. His fiancée whispered something in his ear, and they both chuckled quietly, as though mocking the very idea that Elena might win. The gavel lifted again. "This court hereby finds." The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a thunderous crash. The sound made every head whip around. Gasps erupted as a tall figure strode inside, his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in from the sea. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his shoulders broad, his expression carved in stone. Everyone in the room recognized him instantly. Alexander Grant, billionaire industrialist, a man so powerful that governments courted his favor and CEOs feared his name. But what shocked them most wasn't his arrival. It was the words that thundered from his lips as he pointed straight at Elena, his voice ringing with unshakable authority. "Stop this trial right now. That child she carries." His eyes locked onto Richard with a fury that could melt steel. "Is mine." The courtroom exploded. Reporters leapt to their feet, cameras flashing so wildly, the chamber looked like a lightning storm. The judge's pen froze midair. Richard's smirk collapsed into a mask of disbelief. His fiancée's jeweled hand flew to her mouth in horror. And Elena? She stood frozen, her heartbeat roaring in her ears, her breath caught somewhere between relief and terror. She hadn't seen Alexander in months. Not since the night everything changed. She had thought he was gone forever. Yet here he was, storming into the courtroom, declaring ownership not of her, but of the tiny life growing inside her. The silence that followed his declaration was suffocating. Whispers raced through the pews like wildfire. Did he just say, "That's Alexander Grant"? The billionaire? What's he doing here? Helena's world tilted on its axis. She wanted to protest, to ask why, to demand answers. But all she could do was stare at the man who had just set the entire courtroom ablaze with 7 simple words. The judge slammed her gavel, desperate to restore order. Silence in the court. Silence. But there was no silencing the chaos that had just been unleashed. And in the middle of it all, Helena realized her life had just changed forever. Because Alexander Grant was not a man who made empty declarations. If he said the baby was his, then he was ready to fight. And the battle that began in that courtroom would destroy everything Richard Hale thought he controlled. The chaos of the courtroom still echoed in Helena's mind long after the gavel's last strike. But before the world knew her name, before cameras turned her tears into headlines, Helena Marshall had been an ordinary woman with extraordinary hopes. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, Helena was the daughter of a nurse and a mechanic. Her father's hands were always calloused from long hours at the auto shop, her mother's smile always weary from night shifts at the hospital. They didn't have much money, but they had love, warm, abundant, and unconditional. Helena grew up believing that with hard work and faith she could build a better life. She was bright, the kind of student who stayed late at the library and helped classmates with their essays. But she wasn't just book smart. Helena had a softness about her, a gentleness that drew people in. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words carried sincerity that made even strangers feel seen. At 23, she met Richard Hale. He was dazzling in every way her world was not. Tall, polished, and ambitious, Richard seemed like the answer to every prayer she'd whispered into the quiet nights. He drove a sleek black car that turned heads, wore suits that spoke of success, and had a confidence that filled any room. To Helena, who was waitressing part-time while finishing her degree in early childhood education, he looked like a dream she wasn't sure she deserved. Their romance was swift, intoxicating. Richard showered her with roses, whispered promises of forever, and made her believe she had stepped into a fairy tale. Her parents, cautious but supportive, warned her not to lose herself in the whirlwind. "Remember who you are," her mother had said softly the night before Helena's wedding. But in her white lace gown, gazing into Richard's eyes, Helena thought she had found everything she had ever wanted. The first years were sweet. They bought a home together, a spacious penthouse in downtown Chicago that overlooked the glittering skyline. Helena left waitressing behind and focused on finishing her degree. Richard encouraged her dreams at first, even boasting to friends about his wife's dedication to education. They attended galas, charity dinners, and exclusive events, where Helena often felt out of place among women draped in diamonds and men who talked about stock portfolios like weather forecasts. Still, Richard always had her hand in his, assuring her she belonged. But slowly, the warmth faded. Richard became busier, his nights longer, his phone calls more secretive. Helena began to notice changes. The sharpness in his tone when she asked about his late arrivals, the way he corrected her in front of others, the sighs of impatience when she spoke of her own plans. The gentle man who had once promised her the world now seemed irritated by her very existence. When Helena discovered she was pregnant, she thought it might save them. She imagined Richard's smile softening, his arms wrapping protectively around her, their marriage finding new purpose in the child they would raise together. For a brief moment, it seemed true. Richard brought her flowers, kissed her forehead, and told her they were starting a new chapter. But the tenderness lasted only weeks. Soon he was gone more often than he was home. When he did return, his cologne smelled unfamiliar, foreign, laced with notes Helena didn't wear. He snapped at her cravings, mocked her swollen ankles, and dismissed her fears about the baby's health. "You worry too much," he would say, brushing her off as though her concerns were nothing but hysteria. The breaking point came the night she found a diamond bracelet in the glove compartment of his car. It wasn't hers. When she confronted him, Richard didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he smirked. "Elena, you've served your purpose. Don't embarrass yourself by clinging to something that's over." Those words seared into her memory like fire. That night she packed a small suitcase and left. Pregnant, heartbroken, and alone, she found herself in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and creaking floors. She had no lawyers, no wealth, no powerful family to defend her. Just the faint flutter of life inside her belly and the determination to protect it at all costs. It was in those darkest days that Elena discovered her true strength. She worked part-time as a receptionist, saving every dollar she could for the baby. She skipped meals so she could afford vitamins, endured long bus rides to prenatal appointments, and ignored the whispers of neighbors who recognized her from tabloids splashed with Richard's smiling face beside his glamorous new fiancée. Each night, she would sit by the window, her hand resting on her growing belly, whispering to her child, "You are not a mistake. You are my reason, and I will fight for you no matter what." But Richard wasn't finished with her. When she filed for child support, his lawyers retaliated with brutal efficiency. They painted her as a gold digger, a woman chasing a billionaire's fortune with lies and manipulation. They filed motion after motion, drowning her in paperwork she couldn't afford to contest. And so the case led her to that courtroom, alone, cornered, silenced, until the moment Alexander Grant walked in. Elena had met him once, months earlier, under circumstances she never expected to revisit. He was nothing like Richard. Where Richard was arrogant, Alexander was deliberate. Where Richard dismissed her, Alexander listened. And though their paths had crossed briefly, she had carried the memory of his piercing eyes ever since. But why had he come now? Why had he declared her child his own? The courtroom buzzed with speculation, but Elena knew the truth was more complicated than any headline. As the gavel struck again and reporters clamored for answers, Elena felt the weight of every eye on her. She was no longer invisible, no longer the discarded ex-wife no one believed in. For better or worse, she had become the center of a storm, and storms have the power to destroy or to cleanse. Elena didn't know it yet, but the secret Alexander Grant carried would shatter everything she thought she knew about her past and her baby's future. The courtroom had never seen such chaos. The usually solemn chamber, lined with mahogany benches polished to a mirror sheen, now buzzed like a disturbed hive. Reporters pressed forward, their cameras flashing in rapid succession while murmurs rolled across the spectators' gallery like a storm tide. The judge's gavel pounded again. "Order, order in the court." Her voice cracked with the strain of trying to rein in the pandemonium, but it was useless. Alexander Grant's arrival had detonated a bomb no one could contain. Elena stood at the center of it all, feeling like a fragile thread about to snap. The high ceilings loomed above her, the carved wooden columns seeming to press down on her shoulders. Every eye in the room darted between her swollen belly and the billionaire now standing so firmly at her side of the aisle. She had been here for hours, suffocating in humiliation, while Richard's lawyers stripped her life bare, word by cruel word. The courtroom had felt like a prison then, cold, merciless, a place where truth didn't matter unless you could afford to buy it. Now suddenly it felt like a stage, one lit so brightly by Alexander's entrance that she couldn't hide, even if she tried. Across the aisle, Richard's empire seemed to manifest itself in the rows of sleekly dressed attorneys, each one armed with leather briefcases and self-satisfied smirks. They embodied everything Richard had built, an empire of intimidation. Richard Hale had clawed his way into the billionaire ranks with ruthless acquisitions and cold calculation. He was known in boardrooms as a shark, in headlines as a genius, but in Elena's life, he had been something far darker. A man who devoured without mercy. He leaned back in his chair now, adjusting the cufflinks that gleamed beneath the lights. His fiancée, Tiffany Monroe, clutched his arm, her jeweled nails digging into his sleeve as though to anchor herself to his fortune. Richard's jaw was tight, his eyes sharp and cutting. For the first time, however, a flicker of unease broke through his polished mask. Because Alexander Grant was not a man easily dismissed. The contrast between the two men was palpable. Richard radiated arrogance born of insecurity. Alexander carried power like a second skin. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need an army of lawyers. His mere presence shifted the atmosphere. Even the judge, who moments earlier seemed ready to dismiss Elena's claims, leaned forward with interest now, her pen hovering above the docket instead of striking it down. Elena tried to steady her breathing as the judge finally addressed the newcomer. "Mr. Grant, this court is in session. You cannot simply—" Alexander's voice cut through her words, deep and unwavering. "Your Honor, this proceeding cannot continue without acknowledging the truth. That child is mine, and I will not allow another man to erase what belongs to me." The room gasped as if one breath had been sucked from every lung. Elena's knees wobbled, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. She wanted to protest, to deny, to ask what game he was playing, but no sound escaped her lips. Richard shot up from his chair, his voice booming. "This is absurd. He's lying, Your Honor. This is nothing but a stunt to derail the case." His lawyers scrambled to their feet, papers shuffling, objections flying like arrows. But Alexander didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with deliberate weight. "I have evidence," he declared, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "And I will present it, but not tonight, not in this circus. When the time is right, the truth will strip away every lie in this room." The judge's gavel cracked again. "Enough, Mr. Grant. You will respect this court or be held in contempt." For a heartbeat, silence stretched. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head in a gesture of controlled respect. "Then let the record show. I will fight for that child." The statement landed like a hammer blow. As the session recessed, the courtroom became a battlefield of whispers. Reporters darted out the doors, rushing to deliver the headline of the century: "Billionaire claims paternity of rival's child." Elena remained frozen in place, her breath shallow. Her world, already shattered by betrayal, was now being rebuilt into something she couldn't comprehend. She glanced toward Richard. His mask of control had cracked, revealing the fury simmering beneath. His empire had always thrived on perception. Investors trusted him because he looked untouchable, because he acted as though every move was under his control. Now, with Alexander's words echoing across every news outlet, Richard's power no longer felt absolute. The setting outside the courtroom mirrored the storm within. Paparazzi swarmed the courthouse steps, their lenses aimed like rifles at the doors. Flashbulbs lit the night, illuminating the stone facade and the fluttering American flag that whipped violently in the wind. Police struggled to contain the crowd, their shouts drowned out by the rising clamor of reporters demanding statements. And in the distance, looming over the city, stood the skyscrapers that defined these men's worlds. Richard's name gleamed in steel across the crown of Hale Tower, a monument to his ego. But even that monument was dwarfed by the sleek black spire of Grant Global Headquarters. Its presence in the skyline, a reminder that Alexander's reach stretched farther, deeper, and higher. This was not just a courtroom battle. It was the collision of empires. For Elena, the contrast was suffocating. She had come here alone, believing she was powerless, her voice swallowed by marble walls and legal jargon. Now she stood between two titans, each claiming a piece of her future, each pulling her into worlds she barely understood. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear back into her tiny apartment, where the only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator and the whisper of her child's heartbeat in the quiet of the night. But the setting had shifted, and there was no turning back. As Alexander approached her quietly, the crowd parting instinctively for him, Elena's pulse quickened. He stopped just inches away, his voice low enough only she could hear. "You're not alone anymore." Her breath caught. She searched his face for deception, for arrogance, for the cold calculation she had come to expect from powerful men. Instead, she found something else, resolve, perhaps even a flicker of something gentler. Before she could respond, Richard's voice thundered across the chamber, filled with venom. "This isn't over, Elena. Not by a long shot. You'll regret ever walking into this court." And as the cameras captured his rage and Alexander's steady silence, Elena realized the courtroom was no longer just a setting for her divorce. It had become the battlefield for her child's very future. Richard Hale had always been a man who thrived on control. From the moment he first stepped into the corporate world, He carried himself like a predator, scanning a crowded savannah, always searching for weakness, always ready to strike. To the public, he was a visionary billionaire, the golden boy of finance who turned failing companies into gold mines. But behind closed doors, the Richard that Elena knew was far more dangerous, a man who saw people as tools, women as trophies, and love as nothing more than leverage. Born the son of a banker, Richard had been groomed for power since childhood. His father taught him that life was not about fairness, but about dominance. At 10 years old, Richard wasn't told bedtime stories. He was handed financial reports and asked to predict stock movements. By the time he entered Harvard Business School, he had already internalized his father's harshest lesson. People are either assets or liabilities. When Richard met Elena, she had been neither. She was an escape, sweet, gentle, untouched by the ruthless world he inhabited. To him, she was refreshing at first, someone who looked at him not as a walking bank account, but as a man. But the novelty wore off quickly. Richard thrived on admiration, and Elena's quiet humility couldn't satisfy his hunger for attention. At corporate parties, when Elena would retreat to the corners of the room, Richard would grow irritated. "Smile more," he'd hiss in her ear. "Do you know how bad it looks when my own wife looks miserable?" If she protested, he would simply plaster on a dazzling grin for the cameras and whisper, "You're lucky to be here at all." It wasn't long before the women Richard surrounded himself with began to change. Models, socialites, influencers, women who knew how to sparkle under the spotlight, who laughed loudly at his jokes, who clung to his arm like they belonged there. Elena noticed, of course. She noticed the lingering glances, the whispered conversations, the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his suits. But every time she asked, Richard dismissed her. "You're paranoid. You're hormonal. You're embarrassing yourself." By the time Elena was 6 months pregnant, Richard had stopped pretending altogether. He flaunted his mistress, Tiffany Monroe, with a brazenness that stunned even his closest allies. Tiffany was everything Richard wanted the world to see: young, glamorous, ruthless in her own right. She adored the spotlight as much as he did, and together they became the couple everyone talked about in society pages. Elena, meanwhile, was reduced to whispers in the background. It wasn't enough for Richard to betray her. He wanted to erase her. At one gala, Elena, already exhausted from pregnancy, had arrived quietly, only to find Richard at the center of the ballroom, Tiffany on his arm. When their eyes met, Richard smirked, lifted his glass of champagne, and turned his back on her. That image, his broad shoulders shielding Tiffany while Elena stood humiliated in front of dozens of guests, would haunt her forever. His cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was small, sharp, like paper cuts that bled slowly. When Elena spoke of baby names, Richard rolled his eyes. "We'll name him whatever I decide." When she worried about expenses, he sneered. "You've contributed nothing, Elena. Don't act like this is your money." When she begged him to come to a doctor's appointment, he scoffed. "I'm building an empire. Do you think I have time for nonsense?" To the outside world, Richard Hale was charming, polished, the man who knew everyone's name and sealed deals with a handshake. But in private, his words cut deeper than any blade. "You were a mistake. No man would want you now. You're nothing without me." And that was the Richard Elena faced in court. Confident, untouchable, flanked by a wall of lawyers who spoke with his voice. He sat in his tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted, while she stood trembling in a faded dress she had bought second-hand. He looked at her not like a woman carrying his child, but like an obstacle to be removed. When Alexander Grant declared the baby was his, Richard's fury erupted. His face twisted with rage, but beneath it all, there was something else: fear. For the first time in years, Richard was not the one in control. The narrative he had so carefully crafted, Elena as the helpless ex-wife, Tiffany as the perfect future bride, was unraveling. But Richard was not a man who accepted defeat. As the courtroom emptied and reporters flooded the steps outside, Richard leaned close to Elena, his voice a venomous whisper only she could hear. "You think this changes anything? You think Grant scares me? I'll bury you. I'll bury him. And I'll make sure that child never knows peace." Elena recoiled, her hand instinctively guarding her belly. His words weren't empty threats. Richard had the money, the power, and the ruthlessness to make them real. Later that night, Richard sat in his penthouse, overlooking the glittering city. Tiffany lounged on the leather sofa sipping wine, her laughter shallow and brittle. Richard ignored her. His mind was already racing, plotting. He had survived hostile takeovers, political scandals, and economic crashes. He would survive this too. Alexander Grant wants a war? Richard muttered, swirling the bourbon in his glass. Then I'll give him one. His phone buzzed. It was one of his lawyers, confirming a strategy to discredit Elena further. They would dig up every detail of her past, twist every truth into a lie, and flood the media with stories that painted her as unstable, manipulative, unfit to be a mother. Richard smiled coldly. In his world, perception was power, and he would weaponize it to destroy her. But what Richard didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to imagine, was that Elena was no longer alone. For the first time, she had someone willing to fight beside her. And Alexander Grant wasn't a man who played by Richard's rules. The battle lines were drawn, but Richard had no idea that the very secret he thought buried would soon rise from the shadows and turn his empire to ash. The morning after the courtroom explosion, Elena Marshall's face was everywhere. The television in the corner of her tiny apartment blared with headlines, each one louder than the last. On one channel, a stern-faced anchor declared, "Billionaire love triangle shakes Chicago courtroom." On another, a smirking talk show host waved the day's newspaper with a headline splashed across the front page, "Ex-wife silenced in court until billionaire claims baby." Elena sat frozen on the worn couch, her hands gripping the armrest, as though it might anchor her in the storm. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters left messages demanding comments. Tabloids twisted her silence into a story of its own. Why won't Elena speak? What is she hiding? She wanted to shut it all out. She wanted to curl into herself and disappear. But her child's kicks reminded her that hiding was no longer an option. Outside her building, the chaos was worse. A swarm of paparazzi camped on the sidewalk, their cameras aimed like rifles at her windows. Every time she stepped outside for groceries or a doctor's appointment, flashes blinded her. Voices shouted cruel questions. Is it Richard's baby or Alexander's? Did you trap him with pregnancy? Are you just another gold digger? Elena's cheeks burned each time. Once she dropped her grocery bag, apples scattering across the pavement as cameras snapped gleefully. She had never felt so small, so exposed. Meanwhile, Richard played his part flawlessly. The morning after the hearing, he appeared on a primetime business show, impeccably dressed, Tiffany Monroe seated beside him like a polished diamond. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, every word calculated. "This is a very painful time," Richard said, shaking his head solemnly. "My heart goes out to Elena, but unfortunately she has been misled. Mr. Grant's claim is a cruel attempt to discredit me, and I can only pray she finds clarity before this damages her even further." Tiffany nodded, her eyes wide with practiced sympathy. "It's tragic," she murmured. "But Richard is strong. He'll get through this." The audience applauded. By the next morning, talk shows dissected every detail of Elena's past. Old college photos were dug up. Anonymous sources described her as unstable, desperate, manipulative. Hashtags trended on social media mocking her, while gossip sites ran polls asking if she was lying about the baby's paternity. Elena scrolled through the comments once, just once. She looks pathetic. Of course she's after the money. That poor baby. Imagine having a mother like that. She threw the phone across the room, her chest heaving. Tears blurred her vision. She had fought so hard to keep her dignity, and now it was being torn apart on screens and in headlines, shredded by strangers who knew nothing about her life. But what stung most was Richard's control over the narrative. He had always been the master storyteller, weaving lies into something polished enough to believe. And now, the world was buying it again. Yet beneath the headlines there was another current building, one Richard hadn't anticipated. When Alexander Grant left the courtroom that day, he didn't speak to reporters. He didn't give statements or pose for cameras. He simply walked to his black car, surrounded by silent bodyguards, his expression unreadable. But silence, in Alexander's case, wasn't weakness, it was power. The speculation only grew stronger. Why had he claimed Elena's baby? What was his connection to her? Why would one of the world's most powerful men step into a scandal that wasn't his? The questions filled every news cycle. Business insiders debated whether this would shake the stock market. Political analysts wondered if Grant's influence would bleed into policy. Social commentators argued over whether Alina was victim or mastermind. And through it all, Alina remained silent. At night, she sat by her apartment window, the city's neon glow casting shadows across her weary face. She whispered to her baby, the only soul who could hear her truth. "I don't know why he said it. I don't know what comes next. But I promise you, I won't let them take you from me." Her strength was wearing thin, though. The media circus was relentless, and her resources were dwindling. Bills piled up. Her lawyer, one she could barely afford, warned her that Richard's team was moving fast to file for full custody, citing her instability and unfit environment. One evening, as she shuffled through stacks of legal documents, a knock rattled her door. Her heart raced. "Paparazzi? Reporters?" She hesitated, but a familiar voice called softly. "Elena, it's me." She opened the door to find Alexander Grant standing in the dim hallway. The fluorescent light flickered above him, but nothing could dim the sharp lines of his face or the calm intensity in his eyes. Behind him, two security men stood discreetly. Elena's breath caught. "Why are you here?" she whispered. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the cramped apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the pile of unopened bills on the table. For a moment, something unreadable flickered across his features. Anger, perhaps, or regret. "You're drowning," Alexander said quietly. "And Richard is the one holding you under. I won't let him destroy you, or the child." Her chest tightened. "Why? Why would you care? You don't even." He cut her off, his voice low but fierce. "Because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about the truth. And the truth is far bigger than Richard Hale." Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to demand answers, to scream that she couldn't trust anyone, not after everything Richard had done. But the way Alexander looked at her, steady, unflinching, made her pause. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. But hope was fragile, and Richard's fury was not finished. Across town, in his glass-walled office overlooking the glittering skyline, Richard Hale watched the latest news broadcast with a clenched jaw. His lawyers were gathered around the conference table, spreading files and whispering strategies. Tiffany poured him a drink, her hand shaking as she set it down. "They're starting to believe him," Richard muttered, his eyes burning with rage. "Grant thinks he can take what's mine. He thinks he can humiliate me." He stood, slamming his glass against the table, bourbon splattering across the polished wood. "No one humiliates Richard Hale. Not Elena. Not Grant. No one." And as he stared out at the city he believed he owned, Richard made a vow that would set the stage for a war unlike anything Elena had ever faced. The days after Alexander's shocking declaration stretched into a blur of misery for Elena. What should have been the most joyful season of her life, the months before meeting her baby, turned into a waking nightmare. She felt it in her body first. The exhaustion was bone deep, the kind of fatigue no sleep could heal. Nights were restless, broken by vivid dreams of courtrooms and flashing cameras. Mornings came with nausea that had little to do with pregnancy and everything to do with dread. Even the baby's kicks, once a source of hope, now came with waves of anxiety. What world was she bringing this child into? The bills piled higher. She stared at the stack each night, unopened envelopes scattered across her kitchen table. Rent, medical costs, legal fees, numbers that mocked her dwindling savings. She had sold her jewelry, the last remnants of Richard's love, but it barely covered the basics. Some nights she skipped meals, convincing herself she wasn't hungry. But her growing child reminded her otherwise, twisting inside her with sharp pangs. Then came the loneliness. Her phone, once alive with messages from friends, now lay silent. People she thought cared for her faded away, too afraid to be associated with the scandal that plastered her face across tabloids. At the grocery store, whispers followed her. "That's her, the one with the billionaire mess." Some women glanced with pity, others smirked with judgment. One even muttered loudly as Elena passed, "Disgusting. Using a baby for money." The humiliation was relentless. One afternoon, Elena braved a doctor's appointment, shielding herself with oversized sunglasses. But as she stepped out of the clinic, she was ambushed. Paparazzi surged forward, cameras flashing, voices barking questions like gunfire. "Who's the father, Elena? Richard or Alexander? Are you planning to trap Grant for his money? Smile for us, baby mama." She clutched her belly, stumbling as microphones shoved into her face. A stranger's hand grazed her arm, trying to pull her closer to the cameras. Panic surged in her chest, her vision blurring. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. Security finally intervened, ushering her into a taxi, but the damage was done. Her humiliation was splashed across the next day's headlines. Alina Marshall meltdown outside clinic. Is she fit to be a mother? That night, Elena collapsed onto her couch, her tears soaking the pillow clutched to her chest. She whispered to her baby, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I'm trying, I swear I'm trying, but I don't know how much longer I can fight." For the first time, a dangerous thought crept into her mind. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe she was nothing without him. Maybe she had no chance of winning. The spiral deepened when her lawyer called. His voice was hesitant, careful, the way doctors speak before delivering bad news. "Elena, I need to be honest. Richard's team has filed for emergency custody. They're claiming you're unstable, financially incapable, and that you've endangered the baby by exposing it to stress and media harassment. If they win, you could lose your child before it's even born." The words gutted her. She dropped the phone, clutching her belly in despair. The thought of losing her baby, her only anchor, her only reason to keep going, was unbearable. Her apartment felt colder than ever that night. The radiator clanked weakly, unable to fight the winter chill seeping through cracked windows. Elena wrapped herself in blankets, rocking herself as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She remembered her mother's voice, soft and steady, "Remember who you are." But who was she now? A discarded wife? A tabloid punchline? A powerless mother-to-be? She drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a nightmare. In it, she stood in a courtroom again, but this time the judge's gavel struck finality. Custody awarded to Richard Hale. Hands reached for her baby, pulling it away while Richard smirked and Tiffany waved to the cameras. Elena screamed, but no sound came. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat, her body trembling. The next morning her reflection startled her. Dark circles hollowed her eyes, her cheeks were gaunt, and her skin had lost its glow. She barely recognized the woman staring back. She whispered bitterly to the mirror, "You're falling apart." And she was. Her breaking point came a week later. The neighbor, pitying her, knocked on her door with a warm casserole. Elena smiled faintly, murmuring thanks. But as soon as the door shut, she crumpled to the floor, sobbing. Even kindness felt like a reminder of her failure. She pressed her face into her hands. "I can't do this. I can't win against Richard. I can't raise a child like this." The thought terrified her, but it wouldn't leave. She felt as though the walls of the apartment were closing in, suffocating her. It was in that moment of despair, when Elena truly believed she might lose everything, that her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. Another cruel headline? Another anonymous number? But the screen flashed a name she never expected. Alexander Grant. Her heart lurched. With trembling fingers, she answered. "Elena?" His deep voice rumbled, steady and commanding, yet gentler than she had ever heard. "I know what Richard is doing. I know you're scared. But listen to me. You're not going to lose this child. Not while I'm here." Tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to let his words wrap around her like armor. But doubt clung to her chest. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you care? Why fight for me?" There was a pause. She could hear his breath, steady, deliberate. Then his answer came like a bolt of lightning. "Because Richard isn't just your enemy, he's mine." And in that moment, Elena realized her collapse was not the end, but the beginning of a war she had never imagined. Elena sat in stunned silence, the phone pressed to her ear. Alexander's words echoed through her mind like thunder rolling across a stormy sky. "Richard isn't just your enemy, he's mine." Her throat tightened. For weeks she had wondered why a billionaire of Alexander Grant's stature would involve himself in her crumbling life. Why risk his reputation for her, a woman who had nothing left but a child? Now, for the first time, she realized the truth was much larger than herself. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what are you saying?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his silence carried weight, as though he was deciding how much of his secret to share. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and unyielding. "Richard Hale destroyed someone I loved," Alexander said. Years ago, long before you married him, he cost me more than money. He cost me family, and I swore I would never let him do the same to another innocent soul." Elena's pulse quickened. She clutched her belly, her mind racing. "Family? What do you mean?" Alexander exhaled slowly. "My sister Claire. She was young, idealistic, and brilliant. She dreamed of running her own design company. Richard promised to invest, to mentor her. She believed him, just like you once did. But he stripped her ideas, stole her work, and left her bankrupt. By the time I pieced it together, it was too late. She never recovered." His voice caught for the briefest second, a crack in his otherwise unshakable composure. "Claire passed away 5 years ago, and Richard walked away richer than ever." Elena's chest ached. She had never heard Alexander speak so personally. The pain in his tone was raw, unpolished, so different from the carefully crafted image the world knew. For the first time, she saw not just a billionaire mogul, but a man scarred by betrayal. "I didn't know," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "No one did," Alexander said. "Richard buried it. He always buries the truth. But when I saw what he was doing to you, Elena, silencing you, crushing you, branding your child as nothing, I couldn't stand by." "Not again." Elena's heart pounded. She thought back to the courtroom, to the way Alexander had stormed in, his voice shaking the walls. It hadn't been random. It had been personal. But there was more in his voice, something unspoken. She sensed it in the way he paused, as though holding back a deeper truth. "Alexander," she asked hesitantly, "is that the only reason you claimed this baby? Because of what Richard did to your sister?" Silence. She waited, her breath shallow. Finally he spoke, his tone sharper now, almost protective. "No, that's not the only reason." Her pulse skipped. "Then, what is it?" He didn't answer over the phone. Instead, he said firmly, "Meet me tomorrow. My driver will take you to my office. If we're going to win this war, you need to know everything, and once you hear it, Elena, nothing will ever be the same again." The line went dead. That night, Elena barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the cracks in her ceiling, her mind replaying his words. Nothing will ever be the same again. Her life was already unrecognizable. How much further could it unravel? Yet beneath the fear, a flicker of anticipation stirred. For the first time, the possibility of truth, not humiliation, not lies, felt within reach. The next morning, Alexander's black car arrived. His driver, a tall man with a calm demeanor, guided Elena past the paparazzi and into the tinted sanctuary of the vehicle. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't blinded by flashing cameras. When she arrived at Grant Global headquarters, she felt dwarfed by its sleek glass facade. The building soared into the sky, its mirrored windows reflecting the city like a titan watching over its domain. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors and golden accents. Executives in tailored suits paused as she walked past, whispering to one another. She was escorted to the top floor, where Alexander's office stretched across an entire wing. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, while minimalist furnishings spoke of wealth and power restrained by discipline. Alexander stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, the morning sun casting him in silhouette. "Elena," he said without turning, his voice calm but firm, "I owe you the truth." She swallowed hard, stepping closer. "Then tell me." He faced her, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "The night we met months ago, it wasn't an accident. I knew who you were. I knew you were Richard's wife, and I knew what he was doing to you." Elena's breath caught. "You? Knew?" "I did. I didn't interfere then because I thought you would leave him on your own. I thought you'd see through his lies. But when I heard about the baby, I realized he would use it against you the same way he used everyone else. And I couldn't allow that." Elena's knees felt weak. She lowered herself into a chair, trying to absorb his words. "So all this time, you've been watching me?" "Yes," Alexander admitted. "Not to control you, but to protect you. I knew Richard would eventually turn his cruelty into a weapon, and now that child is in the crossfire." She pressed her hand to her belly, a mix of fear and gratitude swirling inside her. "And when you said the baby was yours," Alexander stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It wasn't a lie. Richard will claim otherwise, but I know the truth. Elena, I know because I have proof, and when I reveal it, Richard's empire will crumble." Elena's heart thundered. She stared at him, searching his face for deception, for arrogance. But all she saw was determination and a strange gentleness she had never expected from a man like him. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why care so much about me and this baby?" His jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. He slid it across the table toward her. "Because this child isn't just your future, Elena," he said softly. "It's mine too." Her breath hitched as she opened the folder. Inside were documents, photos, DNA results she couldn't fully comprehend at first glance. But one line leapt out at her like a bolt of lightning. Alexander Grant was not claiming the baby as a strategy. He was claiming it because he was telling the truth. Elena's world spun. She clutched the folder with trembling hands, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew about her past, her marriage, her child, it all blurred into something new, terrifying and unstoppable. And before she could even form the words to ask what this meant, Alexander's phone rang. His assistant's urgent voice cut through the room. "Sir, Richard Hale just called a press conference. He's about to announce something that could change everything." Elena's blood ran cold, because Richard's lies were about to go public, and the war for her baby had officially begun. Elena sat frozen in Alexander's office, her hands trembling as she held the folder that confirmed the impossible. The DNA results weren't lies, weren't rumors, weren't weapons of manipulation. They were fact. The child growing inside her was tied not to Richard Hale, the man who had broken her spirit, but to Alexander Grant, the man who had just vowed to fight for her. Her thoughts swirled in chaos. Relief, confusion, fear, and disbelief crashed against one another until she could hardly breathe. But beneath all of it, buried deep, like a seed waiting for sunlight, something new began to stir. Strength. For months, Elena had been drowning. She had lived in shadows, humiliated, silenced, her voice stripped away by Richard's power. But now, staring at those papers, she felt something she hadn't in so long: control. For the first time, the truth was hers to hold, not Richard's to bury. "Elena?" Alexander said quietly, his gaze steady. "This changes everything. But Richard will fight harder now. He'll stop at nothing to protect his empire. If you want to win, you can't hide anymore. You must face him head on." Her chest tightened, but she nodded. She thought of her baby, her reason for everything. She thought of the whispers, the headlines, the ridicule. And then she thought of standing in court again. This time not as a silenced victim, but as a woman unafraid. "You're right," she said softly. "I won't let him take anything else from me." The next few weeks became the turning point of Elena's life. Alexander arranged for a legal team, not just any lawyers, but the best in the country, people who weren't afraid to stand against Richard Hale. But Elena quickly realized that lawyers alone wouldn't win this war. She needed to change too. She began with her mind. She attended strategy meetings, listened intently as the team outlined options, and learned the language of contracts and custody laws. The same woman who once sat silent in court now asked questions, challenged assumptions, and demanded clarity. Her voice, once fragile, grew firmer with each passing day. Then came her image. For months, tabloids had painted her as weak, unstable, desperate. She decided to reclaim the narrative. With Alexander's connections, she was introduced to a stylist who helped her choose clothes that reflected strength rather than fear. Sleek dresses in bold colors, tailored jackets that emphasized confidence. Gone were the oversized sweaters meant to hide her belly. Now, she embraced it, walking into meetings with her head held high, her child's presence a symbol of resilience rather than shame. But the transformation wasn't just external. Elena began to heal from the inside. Therapy sessions helped her confront Richard's cruelty, to untangle the knots of humiliation he had tied around her heart. She cried, she raged, she remembered every cutting word he had used to break her. And slowly, she began to see that his power over her had never been truth. It had only been fear. With every tear shed, every memory faced, Elena reclaimed a piece of herself. Her reflection in the mirror began to change. The hollow-eyed woman she once pitied was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone fiercer. Her smile was no longer forced. It was the quiet smile of a woman who had survived fire and was ready to rise from its ashes. The media, of course, noticed. When Elena made her first public appearance after weeks of silence, reporters gasped. Cameras clicked furiously as she stepped out of Alexander's car in a crimson dress that seemed to set the entire sidewalk ablaze. Her hair framed her face softly, her makeup understated but flawless. Most striking of all was her demeanor. No downcast eyes, no trembling hands. Instead, she walked through the crowd with calm dignity, her hand resting proudly on her belly. The next day, headlines shifted. Elena Marshall, from victim to fighter. The woman Richard couldn't break. Richard, of course, fumed. In his penthouse, he smashed a glass against the wall, shards scattering across the marble. "She thinks she can play my game?" he roared. Tiffany hovered nervously, unsure whether to soothe him or stay silent. But Elena wasn't playing his game anymore. She was writing her own. Her transformation extended beyond the courtroom and cameras. At home, she prepared for her baby with renewed determination. She painted the nursery herself, pale yellow walls with tiny hand-painted stars. Each brushstroke felt like defiance against Richard's threats, each star a promise of hope to the child who had given her the courage to fight. One evening, Alexander visited as she placed the final touches on the room. He stood in the doorway, watching her quietly. "You've changed," he said softly. Elena turned, her eyes meeting his. "No," she corrected gently. "I've come back to who I really was before Richard tried to take it away." For a moment, silence stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Then Alexander stepped closer, his voice low. "You're stronger than you know, and when the time comes, Richard won't stand a chance." Elena smiled faintly, but inside, her heart raced. For the first time she believed him, but their battle was far from over. Richard wasn't retreating, he was preparing his own strike. His press conference had already painted him as the victim of a cruel conspiracy, claiming Elena and Alexander were colluding to ruin him. His lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to choke Elena's team with endless paperwork. Still, Elena refused to crumble. She studied each filing, attended every meeting, and prepared herself for the day she would face Richard in court again. Not as the silenced ex-wife, but as a woman armed with truth and dignity. Yet just as hope began to bloom, a new blow struck. Late one night, Elena received an anonymous envelope slipped under her door. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photos, grainy, shadowy images of her leaving Alexander's office, of him entering her apartment. Scrawled across the final photo in red ink were the words, "Unfit mother, unfaithful woman, the world will believe me, not you." Elena's blood ran cold. Richard wasn't just fighting in court anymore. He was preparing to destroy her reputation in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And as she stared at the photos, Elena realized her transformation had prepared her for war. But Richard was about to unleash his most vicious attack yet. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers that dripped golden light over Chicago's elite. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked, and reporters lined the back wall, waiting for the moment the evening would erupt into drama. This was Richard Hale's night. A charity gala he had turned into a stage to parade his power and silence his enemies. At the center of the room, Richard stood tall, his smile as polished as his black tuxedo. Tiffany Monroe sparkled on his arm, her sequined gown catching every flicker of light. To the casual observer, he looked untouchable, an empire wrapped in human form. But not everyone in the room was there to admire him. Elena Marshall stood just beyond the ballroom doors, her heart pounding in her chest. She adjusted the emerald green gown that hugged her figure, her hand brushing her rounded belly. Weeks ago, she would have trembled at the thought of walking into Richard's world again. Tonight, she carried herself with unshakable resolve. Beside her, Alexander Grant exuded calm authority. He leaned down slightly, his voice steady. "This is your moment, Elena. Not mine. Speak the truth, and the world will finally hear you." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. She wasn't the silenced ex-wife anymore. She wasn't the woman Richard could mock, dismiss, or erase. Tonight, she would reclaim her voice, and she would do it where he least expected. The orchestra's music swelled as Elena entered the ballroom. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and gasps rippled through the crowd. She moved gracefully, her gown trailing behind her like a wave of defiance. Cameras whirred, capturing every second. Richard's smile faltered. "Elena?" Tiffany hissed, clutching his arm. Richard masked his shock with a smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, lifting his glass, "a surprise guest, my ex-wife." The crowd chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or hold their breath. Elena didn't waver. She stepped onto the small stage near the podium, her heels clicking against the marble floor. For a moment, the microphone stood between her and a sea of skeptical faces. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. And then, she spoke. "My name is Elena Marshall," she began, her voice clear and steady. "For months, I've been called a liar, a gold digger, an unfit mother. I've been silenced in courtrooms and ridiculed in headlines. Tonight, I'm here to tell the truth. Not for Richard Hale, not for Alexander Grant, but for my child." The room fell into silence. Cameras zoomed in. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his smirk slipping. She lifted a folder, the very folder Alexander had given her weeks before. Her fingers didn't shake this time. "These are documents Richard hoped you'd never see. Proof of his corruption. Proof of the companies he destroyed, the families he ruined, and the lies he built his empire on." Rumors erupted. Reporters scrambled closer, pens flying across notepads. Richard stormed forward, his face dark with rage. "This is slander. She's unstable. Don't listen to her." But Elena's voice cut through his fury. "And here," she held up the DNA results, her eyes blazing, "is proof of the child I carry. Not Richard's, as he's claimed, but Alexander Grant's. Richard wanted to erase us, but he cannot erase the truth." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Tiffany's face drained of color. Richard's mask shattered completely, fury twisting his features. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think anyone here believes you?" Alexander stepped forward then, not to steal her spotlight, but to drive the nail deeper. His presence commanded silence. "Believe her," he said coldly, "because every word she speaks will be backed by evidence. Richard Hale's reign ends tonight." Reporters surged, shouting questions. Guests whispered in shock. The orchestra had fallen silent, the room now a courtroom of its own. Elena stood tall at its center, her belly pronounced, her eyes bright with unyielding strength. Richard lunged toward the microphone, but Tiffany grabbed his arm. "Stop, Richard," she hissed, panic in her eyes. "They're watching." "Don't." He yanked free, roaring into the mic. "She's nothing. She's a pathetic woman trying to destroy me because she couldn't keep me. And you." He turned, pointing a shaking finger at Elena. "You'll regret this for the rest of your miserable life." But his outburst only sealed his fate. The cameras captured every venomous word, every crack in his perfect facade. The crowd recoiled, their admiration curdling into disgust. Elena raised her chin, her voice steady and calm in contrast. "I may have been weak once, Richard. I may have let you silence me, but not anymore. You will not define me, you will not take my child, and you will not control the truth." The applause began slowly, hesitant claps from a few brave guests. But then it spread, rising into a roar that filled the ballroom. Reporters shouted questions, flashes blinded the room, and Elena stood in the center of it all, unshaken. Richard's face twisted as he realized the truth. His empire of lies was crumbling, and the woman he had tried to destroy had just dismantled him in front of the world. Security began to close in, guests whispering about investigations, lawsuits, and scandals that would follow. Tiffany slipped away quietly, leaving Richard to stand alone in the spotlight he once craved. Elena felt the weight of months of humiliation lift from her shoulders. She had spoken, she had fought, and she had won something Richard could never take back, her dignity. But as she left the stage, Alexander close at her side, a reporter shouted a question that pierced through the noise and froze Elena in place. "Elena, now that Richard Hale's lies are exposed, what comes next for you and Alexander Grant?" Elena turned, her eyes meeting Alexander's. The cameras caught the charged silence between them, the weight of unspoken truths still lingering. And in that moment, Elena realized her public victory was only the beginning, because the fight for her child's future and her own heart was about to reach its final, breathtaking climax. The days after the gala unraveled like a storm sweeping across the city. Richard Hale, once untouchable, found himself drowning in scandal. News outlets replayed his furious outburst alongside Elena's calm defiance. Former business partners distanced themselves, shareholders demanded explanations, and federal investigators opened files that Richard thought had been buried years ago. For the first time, Richard wasn't writing the narrative. He was trapped in it. Meanwhile, Elena Marshall's name transformed in the headlines. She was no longer the silenced ex-wife or the unstable mother-to-be. Now she was hailed as the woman who stood against a billionaire and won. Strangers sent letters of support. Mothers reached out to tell her she had inspired them. and neighbors who once whispered in judgment now smiled warmly when they saw her. But the real battle was still ahead. The custody hearing loomed, the final stage in Richard's relentless attempt to take her child. Elena knew this was where everything would be decided. Not in galas, not in tabloids, but in the solemn quiet of the courtroom. On the morning of the trial, Elena stood before the mirror. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her belly curved proudly beneath the fabric, no longer something to hide, but something to honor. She placed a hand over it and whispered, "We're almost there." Alexander met her at the courthouse steps. The cameras swarmed, but Elena didn't flinch. Alexander offered his arm, not as a shield, but as a steady reminder she wasn't alone. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, more than ever. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Richard sat across the aisle, his once impeccable appearance marred by exhaustion and rage. Tiffany was absent, having vanished from the public eye after the gala disaster. His lawyers whispered frantically, but Richard's eyes stayed locked on Elena, burning with hatred. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Richard's team launched their attacks, painting Elena as unstable, financially incapable, and manipulated by Alexander. They presented photos, rumors, twisted stories. But this time, Elena did not shrink under the weight of their words. She sat tall, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Then it was her turn. Elena stood, her voice steady as she addressed the judge. "I have been called many things. Weak, desperate, a liar. But none of those words are true. I am a mother, and every step I have taken, every humiliation I have endured, has been to protect the child I carry. This isn't about money. This isn't about revenge. This is about love, and about refusing to let that love be destroyed by Richard Hale's lies." The room was silent. Her lawyers presented the evidence Alexander had unearthed. Proof of Richard's fraud, testimonies from people he had ruined, and the DNA results confirming her child was Alexander's, not Richard's. Each piece of truth chipped away at Richard's empire until even his lawyers struggled to defend him. Finally, the judge delivered the decision. Custody is awarded to the mother, Elena Marshall. Richard Hale's petition is denied. The words washed over Elena like a tide of relief. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched her belly, whispering, "We did it." Richard erupted, slamming his fists on the table, shouting threats no one cared to hear. Security escorted him out as cameras flashed, capturing the fall of a man who once believed he could never lose. Outside the courthouse, Elena faced the sea of reporters once more. But this time, she didn't hide. She stepped forward, her head high, and spoke into the microphones. "For months I was afraid. Afraid of Richard, afraid of the lies, afraid of the world's judgment. But I learned something. Fear only has power if you let it. To every woman who has been silenced, to every mother who has been doubted, know this: your voice matters. Your truth matters. And no one, no matter how powerful, can take that from you." The crowd erupted in applause. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers. For Elena, it wasn't just a victory in court, it was a victory for her soul. That evening, she returned to her apartment, but it no longer felt like the cage it once was. It was simply the last chapter of a story she was ready to leave behind. Alexander arrived quietly, carrying a small bouquet of lilies. He set them on her table, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "You were extraordinary today," he said. Elena smiled faintly. "I was terrified." "And yet you stood," Alexander replied. "That's what strength is, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it win." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Elena looked at him, her voice gentle but firm. "Why did you fight so hard for me, Alexander? For us?" He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because I lost my sister to Richard's cruelty. I couldn't save her. But when I saw you, I knew I couldn't stand by and let it happen again. And somewhere along the way it stopped being about revenge. It became about you." Her heart thudded. She searched his face, finding no trace of the manipulation she had once feared. Only honesty. Only a man who had fought beside her when no one else would. "Alexander," she whispered, emotion thick in her throat. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm not afraid of it anymore." He reached for her hand, his touch steady, grounding. "Then we'll face it together." Weeks later, Elena stood in the nursery she had painted herself. The pale yellow walls glowed in the afternoon sun, the tiny stars she had painted twinkling faintly in the light. Her baby's crib sat ready, soft blankets folded neatly inside. As she placed the final stuffed animal, a small teddy bear, into the crib, a tear slid down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was gratitude, hope, love. Her child would be born into a world where truth had triumphed, where she had found her voice, where she had risen stronger than the man who tried to break her. And as she rocked gently in the nursery chair, her hand resting on her belly, she whispered to her unborn baby, "You saved me. You gave me strength I didn't know I had, and I promise you will never live in fear." Outside, the world still buzzed with headlines, with scandals, with endless noise, but inside that small nursery, there was peace. Elena had found not just survival, but victory. Not just dignity, but love. And as the chapter closed on Richard Hale's empire, a new chapter began, one where Elena Marshall was no longer a silenced ex-wife, but a mother, a fighter, and a woman reborn. So, my dear friends, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with me right now, it means something inside this journey touched your heart in its own way. Elena's fight wasn't just about winning against Richard. It was about rediscovering her voice, her dignity, and her courage. Isn't that what we all need sometimes? As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Life will always bring trials, but it's our response that shapes who we are. So let this story remind you that no matter how broken you feel, you can rise stronger, you can heal, and you can protect what matters most. If this spoke to you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need hope tonight, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the soul.